Hey, you sister students. Today we're going to roll through the 1980s and early 1990s and talk about the rise of conservatism and the presidencies of Ronald Reagan and George H.W. Bush. Okay, the major view of conservatives is to have less government, a smaller government. And that's going to get government out of the lives of everyday citizens as much as possible. Since the New Deal, when we talked about FDR, he increased the size of government with his New Deal to try to get the United States back on track out of the Great Depression. And since then, American society had been steadily increasing. Government had been steadily increasing. But under Reagan and Bush, the size of government was cut back in several areas. So reduced taxes, reduce regulations on businesses, trying to increase competition. But one area where there was an increase is going to be in military spending. So we decrease several areas, but we increase in military spending. Mainly that's due to the Cold War heightening in the 80s with the Soviet Union. Okay, let's talk about Reagan a little bit. Reagan actually is an actor before he becomes a politician. And he was originally a Democrat when he first got into politics, but he felt like the Democrats were advocating for too much government interference, felt like they wanted too big of a government, and so he changed and switched to the Republican Party. He left the Democratic Party. He was actually governor of California before he ran for office being president, and when he ran for president, he chose George H.W. Bush as his running mate in 1980. They ran against Carter, and they won in 1980. Main reasons why they won in 1980: the inflation of the 70s. Remember, the economy of the 70s stunk, bad economic problems, and the Iranian hostage crisis. So these two major issues push most or a lot of Americans towards Reagan, and Reagan wins and beats out Jimmy Carter, the incumbent, in 1980 by a very large margin. You can see the map here, Reagan versus Carter. Now, another reason why Reagan won is he had these conservative groups behind him that were emerging, that were endorsing him, and so we're going to talk about a few of those. The first one is the NRA, the National Rifle Association. This began as just like the name says, a rifle association that was trying to promote rifle shooting and marksmanship skills and all that kind of stuff. But in the late 60s, Congress started to try to control guns more in the United States, mainly due to several assassinations that had occurred in the 60s, like JFK, his brother Robert, MLK. And so the Gun Control Act of 1968 was passed, and so the NRA did not like gun control measures being passed, so they started to get into politics and started to endorse candidates who would be for more gun rights. And they endorsed Ronald Reagan for the first time ever in 1980. The next group that backed Reagan and other conservatives of the 80s was called the Moral Majority. They named themselves the Moral Majority. This was a conservative group. It was started by this guy's name was Jerry Falwell, and he led a group of fundamentalist Christians. Now, fundamentalist Christians, they believe in a strict interpretation of the Bible, a literal interpretation of the Bible, and they're very socially conservative. So they think that the government should enforce morals on the people. They were anti-communist. They were against the ERA. A few more things the Moral Majority was against. They were against abortion. They were against the recognition and acceptance of homosexuality and same-sex marriage. They were against equal rights amendment for women. They felt like the women's place was at home and not on equal standing with men. They were against the strategic arms limitation talks, the SALT talks of both Nixon, SALT 1, and Carter, SALT 2, because they were anti-communist and they felt like we should not be making deals with communist countries. And they wanted to enforce a traditional vision of family life, and they wanted to censor media that was anti-family, so that shows, radio, whatever. They wanted to censor certain things that they felt like that went against family traditional values. The next group is the Heritage Foundation. This is a think tank. Now, a think tank is a group, an organization. They do research. They have certain things that they want to see happen, and they advocate for those causes and those things. And so the principles of the Heritage Foundation, these conservative principles, are going to be less social values and more economic values and limited government values, like free enterprise, so capitalist economy, limited government, individual freedoms to choose, traditional values, so that is kind of the family values, and a strong national defense. We want to spend lots of money on defense spending. So the Heritage Foundation is going to try to influence legislators to support bills that fit in with these goals right here. And they supported Reagan in the 80s. All right, a few Reagan domestic policies. So Reagan wanted to limit government. He felt like government was not the solution to problems. He said government was the problem. And so he introduced what's known as Reaganomics. So we still had stagflation. Remember, stagflation is going to be increasing unemployment and increasing inflation. That's a double whammy. That's bad. So supply-side economics is the basis for Reaganomics. So we're going to reduce taxes. We're going to reduce business regulations. We're going to make it easier for businesses to make money so that they can provide jobs. In 1983, the United States starts to emerge out of a recession. But also another part of Reaganomics is increased military spending. So we're in the Cold War. We want to build up military. We want to promote peace through strength, which we'll get into in a moment. When we get into national debt in the 80s, Reagan wanted to balance the budget. He talked about balancing the budget, but ended up taking the country into a deficit that Bush would continue later in the 80s. But basically, because of the defense spending, because of the Cold War, we have the U.S. going further into debt in the 80s. Okay, another Reagan domestic policy is he appointed Sandra Day O'Connor to the Supreme Court, who was the first woman to be appointed to the Supreme Court. So she began as a conservative, which is why Reagan nominated her to the Supreme Court or appointed her there. But later she became more of a swing vote and kind of sat on the fence a little bit and became kind of the deciding vote between the conservatives and the liberals on the court. The 80s, we see a movement of Americans. Now, until the 1970s, most Americans lived in the section of the country known as the Midwest and the Northeast. The South, it was too hot down here in the South and the West. It was too dry and remote. But because of new technological advances like dams that are creating electricity and sending water, and air conditioning makes the South and West more level where it's hot, now this area, known as the Sun Belt, is starting to boom. And people are starting to move to the South and the West during the 80s and into the 90s and even into the 2000s. Okay, we come to 1984, and most Americans are satisfied with Reagan. Reagan wins in another landslide victory in 1984. The Republicans of Reagan and Bush defeat the Democrats, Mondale, Ferraro. This is an important election, though, because we have the first woman on a major party ticket. So a first woman on the ticket for either the Republicans or the Democrats. So Geraldine Ferraro, first one on the ticket for the Democrats, the vice presidency. Even though the Democrats get trounced in 84, this is a big step for women in the United States. Okay, several things on Reagan foreign policy. He felt like America needed to be the main defender of freedom and democracy in the world. It was our job to defend that. And so the Reagan doctrine is going to kind of change the containment doctrine. So no longer are we just going to contain communism, but we're going to roll back communism. We're going to get rid of communism where it exists if we can. And a big policy you need to know is peace through strength. So he says, of the 4 wars in my lifetime, none came about because the U.S. was too strong. If we can make ourselves so strong that no one is going to attack us, we can achieve peace that way. So no one's going to attack us if we're too big, too powerful. So we're going to focus on building up the military, on becoming powerful. Another way to defend ourselves, he proposed something called the Strategic Defense Initiative, nicknamed Star Wars. that would be a high-tech way to use satellites and other technology to shoot down any missiles that are headed towards the United States. So that's SDI. This never actually came into fruition, but it was this huge initiative that was undertaken under the Reagan administration. Here's Strategic Defense Initiative, the satellites. So here's just like their logo. We're going to try to shoot down missiles that are headed towards the United States using satellites and lasers. Here's a picture of what it would have looked like. Okay, some more foreign policy under Reagan. 1982, the Israelis invade Lebanon and set off a civil war between Christians and Palestinians. And so Lebanon requests support from the United States, and Reagan sends in U.S. Marines into Lebanon in 1982. Now, this is significant because 1983, a suicide bomber attacks the U.S. Marine barracks where the Marines were living in Beirut, Lebanon, and 241 Marines are killed. And so Reagan withdraws the Marines at this time from Lebanon. But this is a huge act of terrorism that hits the Marines, hits the United States in the 80s, and is a big deal that's happening in 1983. All right, more Reagan foreign policy. A big scandal that broke during the Reagan administration was known as the Iran-Contra affair. And what the Iran-Contra affair is the Contras are going to be rebels fighting in Nicaragua. So I'm going to put an N right here for Nicaragua. That kind of looks like an N. And then over here we have Lebanon, and we've got American hostages in Lebanon. And then over here in Iran, you've got a country that supports terror around the globe. Now, Reagan's officials wanted to release American hostages from Lebanon, and in order to do so, they worked with Iran. So they sold weapons to Iran, right here. Sold weapons to Iran in exchange for their help in releasing the American hostages. Now they took the money from the weapon sales in Iran and they funneled it to these rebels that were fighting against the communist government in Nicaragua. Now the problem here is twofold. A, Iran is a country that's deemed to sponsor terror. And the United States has a policy of not negotiating or making a deal with terrorists. But they secretly did so to help get the release of these American hostages. Part B is Congress had prohibited any U.S. aid to these rebels. But what Reagan's people did is they took the money from the weapon sales to the terrorists in Iran and funneled it down to the rebels in Nicaragua. Now, this was investigated, and it showed that Reagan did not have any direct part in this deal, but he did fail to monitor the actions of his officials. This happened under his watch. Several officials were convicted of lying to Congress, not flying to Congress like this says, but of lying to Congress, and were put in jail. And the Iran-Contra affair actually tarnished America's credibility in the world, caused people to question their faith in government. What else is the government doing? If the government's doing this without us knowing, what else are they doing? So it was a big-time blunder, big problem for Reagan and his administration. And finally, towards the end of Reagan's administration, we see kind of a decline in the Cold War. Reagan's presidency, the end of his presidency, is kind of the beginning of the end, if you will, of the Cold War. You have Mikhail Gorbachev becoming leader of the Soviet Union in 1985. He implements several policies and reforms in place, giving the Soviet people more freedom, more choice in their government. And Some historians give that most of the credit for taking down the Soviet Union because, hey, if you give people that have been suppressed for years and years, give them a little taste of freedom, give them a little taste of choice, they're going to want more and more and more, and they're going to demand that of their government. And ultimately, it's going to lead to the downfall of the government. Other historians, other people say that it was Reagan's policies in the 1980s of building up the military. Remember, peace through strength, putting pressure on the Soviets, forcing them to build up their military as well, and their economy wasn't as strong and able to withhold that like the American economy was, and so ultimately the Soviets fell. And then there's those that are in the middle that like to say, hey, it's a little of both, and I probably think that that's probably the best way to go as well.